Australian literature is the written or literary work produced in the area or by the people of the Commonwealth of Australia and its preceding colonies. During its early Western history, Australia was a collection of British colonies. As such, its recognized literary tradition begins with and is linked to the broader tradition of English literature. However, the narrative art of Australian writers has, since 1788, introduced the character of a new continent into literature, exploring such themes as aboriginality, mateship, egalitarianism, democracy, national identity, migration, Australia's unique location and geography, the complexities of urban living, and the beauty and the terror of life in the Australian bush. Australian writers who have obtained international renown include the Nobel-winning author Patrick White, as well as authors Christina Stead, David Malouf, Peter Carey, Bradley Trevor Grieve, Thomas Keneally, Colleen McCullough, Neville Shute and Morris West. Notable contemporary expatriate authors include the feminist Germaine Greer, art historian Robert Hughes and humorists Barry Humphries and Clive James. Among the important authors of classic Australian works are the poets Henry Lawson, Banjo Paterson, C. J. Dennis and Dorothea Mackellar. Dennis wrote in the Australian vernacular, while Mackellar wrote the iconic patriotic poem My Country. Lawson and Paterson clashed in the famous Bulletin debate over the nature of life in Australia, with Lawson considered to have the harder-edged view of the bush and Paterson the romantic. 2. Lawson is widely regarded as one of Australia's greatest writers of short stories, while Paterson's poems remain amongst the most popular Australian bush poems. Significant poets of the 20th century included Dame Mary Gilmore, Kenneth Slessor, A. D. Pope and Judith Wright. Among the best-known contemporary poets are Les Murray and Bruce Daw, whose poems are often studied in Australian high schools. Novelists of classic Australian works include Marcus Clarke, For the Term of His Natural Life, Miles Franklin, My Brilliant Career, Henry Handel Richardson, The Fortunes of Richard Mahoney, Joseph Furphy, such as Life, Rolf Boulderwood, Robbery Under Arms, and Ruth Park, The Harp in the South. In terms of children's literature, Norman Lindsay, The Magic Pudding, Mem Fox, Possum Magic, and May Gibbs, Snugglepot and Cuddlepie, are among the Australian classics, while Melina Marchetta, Looking for Alibrandi, is a modern YA classic. Eminent Australian playwrights have included Ray Lawler, David Williamson, Alan Seymour and Nick Enright. Among prominent short story writers are Steele Rudd, Henry Lawson, Beverly Farmer, Kate Grenville, and Helen Garner. Although historically only a small proportion of Australia's population have lived outside the major cities, many of Australia's most distinctive stories and legends originate in the outback, in the drovers and squatters and people of the barren, dusty plains. David Unaipon is known as the first Aboriginal author. Ogeru Nunukul was the first Aboriginal Australian to publish a book of verse. 4. A groundbreaking memoir about the experiences of the stolen generations can be found in Sally Morgan's My Place. Charles Bean, Geoffrey Blaney, Robert Hughes, Manning Clark, Claire Wright, and Marcia Langton are authors of important Australian histories. Writing by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. While his father, James Unaipon, circa 1835–1907, contributed to accounts of Aboriginal mythology written by the missionary George Taplin, 5. David Unaipon, 1872–1967, provided the first accounts of Aboriginal mythology written by an Aboriginal, Legendary Tales of the Aborigines. For this he is known as the first Aboriginal author. Ogeru Nunukul, 1920–1993, was a famous Aboriginal poet, writer and rights activist credited with publishing the first Aboriginal book of verse, We Are Going, 1964. Sally Morgan's novel My Place was considered a breakthrough memoir in terms of bringing Indigenous stories to wider notice. Leading Aboriginal activists Marcia Langton, First Australians, 2008, and Noel Pearson, Up from the Mission, 2009, are active contemporary contributors to Australian literature. The voices of Indigenous Australians are being increasingly noticed and include the playwright Jack Davis and Kevin Gilbert. Writers coming to prominence in the 21st century include Kim Scott, Alexis Wright, Kate Howarth, Tara June Winch, Yvette Holt and Anita Heiss. Indigenous authors who have won Australia's high-prestige Miles Franklin Award include Kim Scott, who was joint winner with Thea Astley in 2000 for Benong and again in 2011 for That Dead Man. Dance. Alexis Wright won the award in 2007 for her novel Carpentaria. Melissa Lukashenko won the award in 2019 for her novel Too Much Lip, which was also shortlisted for the Stella Prize for Australian women's writing. Letters written by notable Aboriginal leaders like Bennelong and Sir Douglas Nicholls are also retained as treasures of Australian literature, as is the historic Yirrkala Bark Petitions of 1963, which is the first traditional Aboriginal document recognised by the Australian Parliament. 7. Austerlitz's Black Words Project provides a comprehensive listing of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander writers and storytellers. Writing about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. At the point of the first colonization, Indigenous Australians had not developed a system of writing, so the first literary accounts of Aboriginal people come from the journals of early European explorers, which contain descriptions of first contact, both violent and friendly. Early accounts by Dutch explorers and by the English buccaneer William Dampier wrote of the natives of New Holland as being barbarous savages, but by the time of Captain James Cook and First Fleet Marine Watkin Tench, the era of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, accounts of Aborigines were more sympathetic and romantic. These people may truly be said to be in the pure state of nature, and may appear to some to be the most wretched upon the earth, but in reality they are far happier than we Europeans, wrote Cook in his journal on the 23rd of August 1770. Many notable works have been written by non-Indigenous Australians on Aboriginal themes. Examples include the poems of Judith Wright, The Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith by Thomas Keneally, Ilberana by Donald Stewart, and the short story by David Malouf, the only speaker of his tongue. 10. Histories covering Indigenous themes include Watkin Tench, Narrative of the Expedition to Botany Bay at Complete Account of the Settlement at Port Jackson, Roderick J. Flanagan, The Aborigines of Australia, 1888. The Native Tribes of Central Australia by Spencer and Gillen, 1899. The Diaries of Donald Thompson on the subject of the Yolngu people of Arnhem Land, circa 1935-1943. Alan Moorhead, The Fatal Impact, 1966. Geoffrey Blaney, Triumph of the Nomads, 1975. Henry Reynolds, The Other Side of the Frontier, 1981. And Marcia Langton, First Australians, 2008. Differing interpretations of Aboriginal history are also the subject of contemporary debate in Australia, notably between the essayists Robert Mann and Keith Windschuttle. Bun was published in Sydney. It was the first Australian novel printed and published in mainland Australia and the first Australian novel written by a woman. It is a Gothic romance. 15. Miles Franklin, My Brilliant Career, and Jeannie Gunn, We of the Never Never, wrote of lives of European pioneers in the Australian bush from a female perspective. Albert Facey wrote of the experiences of the goldfields and of Gallipoli, A Fortunate Life. Ruth Park wrote of the sectarian divisions of life in impoverished 1940s inner city Sydney, The Harp in the South. The experience of Australian POWs in the Pacific War is recounted by Neville Shute in A Town Like Alice and in the autobiography of Sir Edward Dunlop. Alan Moorhead was an Australian war correspondent and novelist who gained international acclaim. A number of notable classic works by international writers deal with Australian subjects, among them D. H. Lawrence's Kangaroo. The journals of Charles Darwin contain the famous naturalist's first impressions of Australia, gained on his tour aboard the Beagle that inspired his writing of On the Origin of Species. The Wayward Tourist. Mark Twain's Adventures in Australia contains the acclaimed American humorist's musings on Australia from his 1895 lecture tour. In 2012, The Age reported that Text Publishing was releasing an Australian Classics series in 2012, to address a neglect of Australian literature by universities and British-dominated publishing houses, citing out-of-print Miles Franklin Award winners such as David Ireland's The Glass Canoe and Sumner Locke Elliott's Careful, He Might Hear You as key examples. Ethel Turner's Seven Little Australians, which relates the adventures of 7 mischievous children in Sydney, has been in print since 1894, longer than any other Australian children's novel. 17. The Getting of Wisdom, 1910, by Henry Handel Richardson, about an unconventional schoolgirl in Melbourne, has enjoyed a similar success and been praised by H.G. Wells and Germaine Greer. 18. Other perennial favorites of Australian children's literature include Dorothy Wall's Blinky Bill, Ethel Pedley's Dot and the Kangaroo, May Gibbs's Snugglepot and Cuddlepie, Norman Lindsay's The Magic Pudding, Ruth Park's The Muddle-Headed Wombat and Mem Fox's Possum Magic. These classic works employ anthropomorphism to bring alive the creatures of the Australian bush. Thus Bunyip Bluegum of The Magic Pudding is a koala who leaves his tree in search of adventure, while in Dot and the Kangaroo a little girl lost in the bush is befriended by a group of marsupials. May Gibbs crafted a story of protagonists modeled on the appearance of young eucalyptus gum tree nuts and pitted these gumnut babies, Snugglepot and Cuddlepie, against the antagonist Banksia men. Gibbs's influence has lasted through the generations. Contemporary children's author Ursula Dubosarski has cited Snugglepot and Cuddlepie as one of her favorite books. In the middle of the 20th century, children's literature languished, with popular British authors dominating the Australian market. But in the 1960s Oxford University Press published several Australian children's authors, and Angus and Robertson appointed their first specialist children's editor. The best-known writers to emerge in this period were Hesba Brinsmed, Ivan Southall, Colin Tila, Patricia Wrightson, Nan Chauncey, Joan Phipson and Eleanor Spence, their works primarily set in the Australian landscape. 20. In 1971, Southall won the Carnegie Medal for Josh. 21. In 1986, Patricia Wrightson received the International Hans Christian Andersen Award. The Children's Book Council of Australia has presented annual awards for books of literary merit since 1946 and has other awards for outstanding contributions to Australian children's literature. Notable winners and shortlisted works have inspired several well-known Australian films from original novels, including the Silver Brumby series, a collection by Ellen Mitchell which recount the life and adventures of Thowra, a Snowy Mountains Brumby Stallion, Storm Boy 1964 by Colin Tila, about a boy and his pelican and the relationships he has with his father, the pelican, and an outcast Aboriginal man called Fingerbone, the Sydney-based Victorian-era time travel adventure playing Beatty Boat 1980 by Ruth Park, and, for older children and mature readers, Melina Marchetta's 1993 novel about a Sydney high school girl looking for Alibrandi. Robin Klein's Came Back to Show You I Could Fly is a story about the beautiful relationship between an 11-year-old boy and an older, drug-addicted girl. Jackie French, widely described as Australia's most popular children's author, has written about 170 books, including 2 CBCA Children's Book of the Year award winners. One of them, the critically acclaimed Hitler's Daughter, 1999, is a what if story that explores mind-provoking issues about what would have happened if Adolf Hitler had had a daughter. French is also the author of the highly praised Diary of a Wombat 2003, which won awards such as the 2003 Coolaward and 2004 Bilby Award, among others. It was also named an honor book for the CBCA Children's Book of the Year Award for Picture Books. Paul Jennings is a prolific writer of contemporary Australian fiction for young people whose career began with collections of short stories such as Unreal 1985 and Unbelievable 1987. Many of the stories were adapted as episodes of the award-winning television show Round the Twist. The world's richest prize in children's literature has been received by 2 Australians, Sonia Hartnett, who won the 2008 Astrid Lindgren Memorial Award 25, and Sean Tan, who won in 2011. Hartnett has a long and distinguished career, publishing her first novel at 15. She is known for her dark and often controversial themes. She has won several awards, including the Kathleen Mitchell Award and the Victorian Premier's Award for Sleeping Dogs, Guardian Children's Fiction Prize and the Aurelius Award, Best Young Adult Novel Australian Speculative Fiction for Thursday's Child and the CBCA Children's Book of the Year Award, Older Readers for Forrest. 26th Circular Reference. Tan won this for his career contribution to children's and young adult literature in the broadest sense. 27. Tan has been awarded various literary awards, including the Deutscher Jugendliteraturpreis in 2009 for Tales from Outer Suburbia and a New York Times Best Illustrated Children's Books Award in 2007 for The Arrival. 27. Alongside his numerous literary awards, Tan's adaptation of his book The Lost Thing also won him an Oscar for Best Animated Short Film. 28. Other awards Tan has won include a World Fantasy Award for Best Artist, 29, and a Hugo Award for Best Professional Artist. 30. A generation of leading contemporary international writers who left Australia for Britain and the United States in the 1960s have remained regular and passionate contributors of Australian-themed literary works throughout their careers, including Clive James, Robert Hughes, Barry Humphries, Geoffrey Robertson and Germaine Greer. Several of these writers had links to the Sydney Push intellectual subculture in Sydney from the late 1940s to the early 1970s, and to Oz, a satirical magazine originating in Sydney, and later produced in London from 1967 to 1973. After a long media career, Clive James remained as a leading humorist and author based in Britain whose memoir series was rich in reflections on Australian society, including his 2007 book Cultural Amnesia. Robert Hughes has produced a number of historical works on Australia, including The Art of Australia, 1966, and The Fatal Short, 1987. Barry Humphries took his Dadaist absurdist theatrical talents and pen to London in the 1960s, becoming an institution on British television and later attaining popularity in the USA. Humphries' outlandish Australian caricatures, including Dame Edna Everage, Barry Mackenzie and Les Patterson, have starred in books, stage and screen to great acclaim over 5 decades, and his biographer Ann Pender described him in 2010 as the most significant comedian since Charles Chaplin. His own literary works include the Dame Edna biographies My Gorgeous Life 1989, and Handling Edna 2010, and the autobiography My Life as Me, a memoir 2002. Geoffrey Robertson KC is a leading international human rights lawyer, academic, author and broadcaster whose books include The Justice Game 1998 and Crimes Against Humanity 1999. Leading feminist Germaine Greer, author of The Female Eunuch, has spent much of her career in England but continues to study, critique, condemn and adore her homeland. Recent work includes Whitefella Jump Up, The Shortest Way to Nationhood, 2004. Martin Boyd, 1893–1972, was a distinguished memoirist, novelist and poet, whose works included social comedies and the serious reflections of a pacifist faced with a time of war. Among his Langton series of novels, The Cardboard Crown 1952, A Difficult Young Man 1955, Outbreak of Love 1957, earned high praise in Britain and the United States, though despite their Australian themes, were largely ignored in Australia. 31. Patrick White 1912–1990 became the first Australian to be awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1973, for an epic and psychological narrative art which has introduced a new continent into literature. 32. White's first novel, Happy Valley 1939, was inspired by the landscape and his work as a jackaroo on the land at Adamanaby in the Snowy Mountains, but became an international success and won the Australian Literary Society's Gold Medal. 33–34. Born to a conservative, wealthy Anglo-Australian family, he later wrote of conviction in left-wing causes and lived as a homosexual. Never destined for life on the land, he enrolled at Cambridge where he became a published poet. White developed as a novelist, but also had major theatrical success, including The Season at Sarsaparilla. White followed The Tree of Man with Voss, which became the first winner of the Miles Franklin Award. A subsequent novel, Riders in the Chariot, also received a Miles Franklin Award, but White later refused to permit his novels to be entered for literary prizes. He turned down a knighthood, and various literary awards, but in 1973 accepted the Nobel Prize. David Marr wrote a biography of White in 1991. 33. J. M. Coetzee, who was born in South Africa and was resident there when awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2003, 35, now lives in Adelaide, South Australia, and is an Australian citizen. 36. Colleen McCulloch's The Thorn Birds, 1977, is Australia's highest-selling novel and one of the biggest-selling novels of all time with around 30 million copies sold by 2009. 37. Thomas Keneally wrote The Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith, 1972 and Schindler's Ark, 1982. This latter work was the inspiration for the film Schindler's List. Other notable Australian novels converted to celluloid include Paul Brickell's The Great Escape, Pamela Lyndon Travers' Mary Poppins, Morris West's The Shoes of the Fisherman and Bryce Courtenay's The Power of One. Careful, He Might Hear You by Sumner Locke Elliott won the Miles Franklin Award in 1963, and was the subject of a 1983 Australian film. Author David Ireland won the Miles Franklin Award 3 times, including for The Glass Canoe 1976. 38. Peter Carey has also won the Miles Franklin Award 3 times, Jack Maggs 1998, Oscar and Lucinda 1989, and Bliss 1981. He has twice won the Booker Prize with 1988's Oscar and Lucinda and 2001's True History of the Kelly Gang. DBC Pierre's Vernon God Little won the Booker Prize in 2003. Other notable writers to have emerged since the 1970s include Kate Grenville, David Malouf, Helen Garner, Jeanette Turner Hospital, Marion Halligan, Susan Johnson, Christopher Koch, Alex Miller, Shirley Hazard, Richard Flanagan, Gerald Murnan, Brenda Walker, Rod Jones and Tim Winton. James Clavell in The Asian Saga discusses an important feature of Australian literature, its portrayal of Far Eastern culture, from the admittedly even further east, but nevertheless Western cultural viewpoint, as Nevil Shute did. Clavell was also a successful screenwriter and along with such writers as Thomas Keneally, see above, has expanded the topics of Australian literature far beyond that one country. Other novelists to use international themes are David Malouf, Beverly Farmer and Rod Jones. The Secret River 2005 is an historical fiction by Kate Grenville imagining encounters between Aboriginal and colonial Australia which was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize. The Slap 2008 was an internationally successful novel by Christos Tsiolkas which was adapted for television by ABC One in 2011, and was described in a review by Gerard Windsor as something of an anatomy of the rising Australian middle class. Grunge Lit, an abbreviation for grunge literature, is an Australian literary genre usually applied to fictional or semi-autobiographical writing concerned with dissatisfied and disenfranchised 40 young people living in suburban or inner-city surroundings. It was typically written by new, young authors, 41, who examined gritty, dirty, real existences, 41, of lower-income young people, whose lives revolve around a nihilistic pursuit of casual sex, recreational drug use and alcohol, which are used to escape boredom or a general flightiness. Romantic love is seldom, as instant gratification has become the norm. 42. It has been described as both a subset of dirty realism and an offshoot of Generation X literature. 43. The term grunge is from the 1990s era music genre of grunge. The genre was first coined in 1995 following the success of Andrew McGahan's first novel Praise, which had been released in 1991 and became popular with sub-30-year-old readers, a previously under-investigated demographic. 41. Other authors considered to be grunge lit include Linda Jaivin, Fiona McGregor and Justine Edler. Since its invention, the term grunge lit has been retrospectively applied to novels written as early as 1977, namely Helen Garner's Monkey Grip. 43. Grunge lit is often raw, explicit, and vulgar, even to the point of Edler's The River Ophelia 1995 being called pornographic. The term grunge lit, and its use to categorize and market this diverse group of writers and authorial styles has been the subject of debate and criticism. Linda Jaivin disagreed with putting all these authors in one category, Christos Tsiolkas called the term a media creation, and Murray Waldron denied grunge lit even was a new genre. He said the works actually are a type of the pre-existing dirty realism genre. 1998–2010s, post-grunge lit. Post-grunge lit is a genre of Australian fiction from the late 1990s, 2000s and 2010s. It is called post-grunge lit to denote that this genre appeared after the 1990s Australian literary genre known as grunge lit. Michael Robert Christie's 2009 PhD dissertation, Unbecoming of Age, Australian Grunge Fiction, the Bildungsroman and the Long Labour Decade, states that there is a genre called post-grunge lit which follows the grunge lit period. Christie names 3 examples of Australian post-grunge lit: Elliot Perlman's $3 1998, Andrew McCann's Subtopia 2005, and Anthony Macris' Capital. Christie's dissertation interprets and explains these 3 post-grunge lit works as responses to the embedding of neoliberalism in Australian and global political culture. Kalinda Ashton, born 1978, has been called a post-grunge writer, in part due to influences from grunge lit author Christos Tsiolkas. Ashton is the author of the novel The Danger Game. Samantha Dagg's 2017 thesis on grunge lit and post-grunge lit states that Luke Carman is a post-grunge writer. 44 Carman's first work, a collection of interlinked semi-autobiographical short stories, explores the authentic experiences of working-class Australians in the suburbs, including issues such as drug addiction and a sense of disillusionment. Australia has migrant groups from many countries, and members of those communities, not always of the first generation, have produced Australian writing in a variety of languages. These include Italian, Greek, Arabic, Chinese, Vietnamese, Lao, Filipino, Latvian, Ukrainian, Polish, Russian, Serbian, Yiddish and Irish. 45. Comparatively little attention has been devoted to such writing by mainstream critics. It has been argued that, in relation to the national literary landscape, such literary communities have a quite separate existence, with their own poetry festivals, literary competitions, magazine and newspaper reviews and features, and even local publishers. 46. Some writers, like the Greek-Australian Dimitris Saloumas, have published bilingually. There are now signs that such writing is attracting more academic interest. 47. Some older works in languages other than English have been translated and received critical and historical attention long after their first publication. For example, the first Chinese-language novel to be published in Australia, and possibly the West, The Poison of Polygamy 1909-10, by Wang Shiping, was published in English for the first time in 2019, in a bilingual parallel edition. 48. History has been an important discipline in the development of Australian writing. Watkin Tench, 1758-1833, a British officer who arrived with the First Fleet in 1788, later published 2 books on the subject of the foundations of New South Wales, Narrative of the Expedition to Botany Bay and Complete Account of the Settlement at Port Jackson. Written with a spirit of humanity, his accounts are considered by writers including Robert Hughes and Thomas Keneally to be essential reading for the early history of Australia. Charles Bean was the official war historian of the First World War and was influential in establishing the importance of Anzac in Australian history and mythology, with such prose as, "Anzac stood, and still stands, for reckless valor in a good cause, for enterprise, resourcefulness, fidelity, comradeship and endurance, that will never own defeat." 49. See works including the story of Anzac, from the outbreak of war to the end of the first phase of the Gallipoli Campaign, the 4th of May 1915, 1921. Australia in the War of 1939-1945 is a 22-volume official history dedicated to Australia's Second World War efforts. The series was published by the Australian War Memorial between 1952 and 1977. The main editor was Gavin Long. A significant milestone was the historian Manning Clark's 6-volume History of Australia, which is regarded by some as the definitive account of the nation. Clark had a talent for narrative prose, and the work published between 1969 and 1987 remains a popular and influential work. Clark's one-time student Geoffrey Blaney stands as another to have deeply influenced Australian historiography. His important works include The Tyranny of Distance 1966, and Triumph of the Nomads, A History of Ancient Australia 1975. Robert Hughes' much-debated history The Fatal Shore, the epic of Australia's founding 1987, is a popular and influential work on early Australian history. Marcia Langton is one of the principal contemporary Indigenous Australian academics, and her 2008 collaboration with Rachel Perkins chronicles Australian history from an Indigenous perspective, First Australians. An Illustrated History. A complicated, multifaceted relationship to Australia is displayed in much Australian writing, often through writing about landscape. Barbara Bainton's short stories from the late 19th century, early 20th century convey people living in the bush, a landscape that is alive but also threatening and alienating. Kenneth Cook's Wake in Fright 1961 portrayed the outback as a nightmare with a blazing sun, from which there is no escape. Colin Teela's novels reflected the life and times of rural and regional Australians in the 20th century, showing aspects of Australian life unknown to many city dwellers. In Australian literature, the term mateship has often been employed to denote an intensely loyal relationship of shared experience, mutual respect and unconditional assistance existing between friends mates in Australia. This relationship of often male loyalty has remained a central subject of Australian literature from colonial times to the present day. In 1847, Alexander Harris wrote of habits of mutual helpfulness between mates arising in the otherwise solitary bush, in which men would often stand by one another through thick and thin. In fact, it is a universal feeling that a man ought to be able to trust his own mate in anything. Henry Lawson, a son of the Goldfields, wrote extensively of an egalitarian mateship, in such works as A Sketch of Mateship and Shearers, in which he wrote, "They tramp in mateship side by side. The Protestant and Roman. They call no biped lord or sir. And touch their hat to no man." What it means to be Australian is another issue that Australian literature explores. Miles Franklin struggled to find a place for herself as a female writer in Australia, fictionalizing this experience in My Brilliant Career 1901. Marie Bjelke Peterson's popular romance novels, published between 1917 and 1937, offered a fresh upbeat interpretation of the Australian bush. The central character in Patrick White's The Twyborn Affair tries to conform to expectations of pre-World War II Australian masculinity but cannot, and instead, post-war, tries out another identity and gender overseas. Peter Carey has toyed with the idea of a national Australian identity as a series of beautiful lies, and this is a recurrent theme in his novels. Andrew McGahan's Praise 1992, Christos Tsiolkas's Loaded 1995, Justine Edler's The River Ophelia 1995, and Brendan Cowell's How It Feels 2010 introduced a grunge lit, a type of gritty realism, take on questions of Australian identity in the 1990s, though an important precursor to such work came some years earlier with Helen Garner's Monkey Grip 1977, about a single mother living on and off with a male heroin addict in Melbourne.